The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above Mercy General's night shift corridors, a sound like electricity slowly poisoning the air. Natalie Hayes pushed a medicine cart down the third-floor hallway at 11:41 p.m., her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum. 3 months. 94 days, to be exact, since she'd walked into Denver and decided to disappear inside the most visible place she could find, a hospital where nobody asked questions about the past, where trauma was the job description, where hands that had held lives together in firefights could hold them together here without explanation. The cartwheel squeaked softly. She touched the inside of her jacket, feeling the faded seal unit patch sewn into the lining, and let her breath settle. 6 faces. She still saw them when fluorescent lights flickered like muzzle flash. She moved into room 312 where Mr. Castellano lay recovering from abdominal surgery, his foreline taped down carelessly by the day shift. The gauze was beginning to loosen. Natalie removed the old dressing with practiced efficiency, examined the site for redness or swelling, found none, then prepped a new one. The adhesive pulled away from his arm like skin. He stirred but didn't wake. She worked with the precise, economical movements of someone who had inserted fur lines not in sterile hospital conditions but in hums bouncing across Helmand Province roads, where one wasted motion meant the needle would slip out and a patient would lose access before the bird could arrive. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. Not since week 5 in Denver, when she'd stopped hearing the sounds of the rotor wash in her sleep and started hearing only rain. At 1:23 a.m., she sat in the break room with a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, her eyes moving across a patient chart spread open on the table beside her. The chart belonged to a post-operative case from Dr. Hargrove's afternoon clinic, a routine appendectomy. The billing code showed a full emergency surgical team consultation fee, $1,400. The operative note she'd pulled from the digital record showed that Dr. Hargrove had performed the surgery alone with one surgical tech, no consults billed. She cross-referenced it against another case from his clinic 3 weeks prior. Same pattern. Appendectomy with unnecessary consult fees totaling $2,847. Her pen hovered over the numbers. She didn't write anything down. She only photographed the page with her phone, the screen brightness low, then deleted the image from her gallery. Too early to move. Too early to flag anything. Too early to be visible. But visibility was already moving toward her, creeping through the corridors like something with a pulse. Dr. Hargrove found her because she was still sitting there when he arrived at 2:15 a.m. to check on a patient he'd admitted earlier. He walked past the break room and saw the chart on the table, saw Natalie closing it too quickly, saw her phone disappearing into her pocket with the too smooth motion of someone who'd practiced the gesture. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything. He only smiled, a small, private smile that belonged only to himself, and continued toward the patient rooms. But in that moment, the game changed. She didn't know it yet. He was already 3 moves ahead. Natalie finished her shift at 7:41 a.m., clocked out by 7:04, and drove back to her studio apartment on Glenarm Place in her used Honda Civic, nothing fancy, nothing memorable. The kind of car that disappeared in parking lots. She made coffee that she didn't drink and sat on her fire escape watching Denver wake up. The morning air was cold and thin, the altitude still catching her off guard even after 3 months. Back in Sanjin, the air had tasted like copper and diesel and dust that got into everything. Here it tasted like nothing, which meant it tasted like survival. She pulled her jacket close and touched the unit patch again. Marcus Chen, call sign Breaker. Jessica Rodriguez, call sign Phantom. David Mitchell, call sign Iron Man. James Jimmy Holloway, call sign Graves. For other names she didn't let herself think about in daylight. 6 faces total. Her hands had been steady when she held the pressure dressing on Phantom's exit wound, steady when she'd called in the 9 line to the bird, steady when they loaded him onto the stretcher. Her hands had been steady every single time except the last time, when it wasn't enough. The apartment was silent. She was good at silence. Natalie returned to Mercy General at 7:16 p.m. the next evening, her badge hanging from a lanyard with 6 other night shift nurses she'd never actually spoken to. In the locker room, she changed into fresh scrubs, solid blue, nothing with logos or names on them. Uniform of the invisible. The charge nurse handed her the assignment list, same floor, same rotation, routine post-op monitoring and one new admission from the ER. She nodded and moved toward the stairs without speaking. The elevator dinged and released a tide of day-shift nurses heading toward the parking garage. One of them, Dr. Patricia Wilson from Trauma, held the door and nodded at Natalie. It was the kind of gesture that meant nothing, or everything, depending on which timeline you were living in. By 9:16 p.m., Natalie had verified vitals on 6 patients and was beginning her documentation when she accessed the electronic health record system to pull billing summaries. It was routine, checking medication costs against insurance claims, making sure the charges matched the documentation. She was, technically, doing her job. The system showed her 17 cases from Dr. Hargrove's patient roster over the past 6 weeks. She examined each one. 4 of them showed the same pattern as the appendectomies, treatment codes that didn't match the operative notes, consult fees for physicians who had never actually consulted, anesthesia charges for procedures that hospital records indicated required minimal sedation. The numbers were professional. Careful. Not obviously fraudulent to someone who wasn't looking. But someone was looking now. She photographed the screen with her phone, fingers moving on pure muscle memory from the years when she documented field injuries for military report backs, keeping records of who made it and who didn't. Evidence. Proof. The kind of thing that mattered when people needed to know what had gone wrong. She deleted the photo immediately and closed the browser. Her coffee was cold. She needed new coffee. In the break room, Dr. Hargrove was waiting. He wasn't obviously waiting. He was sitting at the small round table with a stack of files, reading something with a pen in his hand. But his eyes flickered toward her when she entered, tracked her movement to the coffee machine, and held on her hands as she poured. Natalie didn't pause. Her breathing didn't change. She added sugar to the coffee in exact spoonfuls, too, just like always, and stirred it with a paper coffee stirrer that made a soft scraping sound against the ceramic mug. When she turned toward the door, Dr. Hargrove was still watching her. "Late-night chart review?" he asked. His voice was the kind of smooth that made skin crawl, cultured, confident, the voice of someone who'd never been told no by an institution before. "Just routine documentation," Natalie said. She kept her voice level, deferential. A nurse talking to a doctor. Nothing more, nothing worth remembering. Patient charts or billing records? She held his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Patient care is the priority, doctor." He smiled again, that same private smile, and returned his attention to his files. "Of course it is. Glad we understand each other." Natalie left the break room and walked back to the 3rd floor, her heart rate elevated by exactly nothing. Just a nurse. A tired night shift nurse going through the motions. A woman who'd learned, years ago, how to make herself small enough to survive. The fluorescent lights hummed around her like a swarm of insects. Rain had started outside, hammering the windows like a code that only certain people could hear. She thought about the 6 faces again, but only for a moment, because the moment she let them in, she couldn't get them out again. Instead, she focused on the patient in room 305 whose blood pressure was trending downward. She focused on vitals and documentation and staying invisible. But Dr. Hargrove was already calling people. In the administrative offices, in the dark hallways of institutional favor, in the places where money moved like blood through systems that nobody questioned. He was making calls about a nurse who moved too smoothly, who asked questions about billing codes, who might become a problem if she developed any ideas about civic responsibility or institutional integrity. He was already spinning the narrative before she'd even done anything worth spinning. He was already placing bets about how long she'd last. And the thing that would come later, the thing that would walk through those ER doors with massive internal injuries and no other doctor willing to touch it, the thing that would keep her working for 16 straight hours while the world watched to see if she'd break, was already rolling toward them both like an avalanche, and neither of them knew it yet. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and institutional ambition when Dr. Hargrove pulled out his wallet. It was 1,445 hours, shift change, and the attendings had gathered around the scheduling board like vultures eyeing a carcass. Natalie stood in the hallway beyond the doorframe, collecting discharge papers from the pneumatic tube, her hands steady, her breathing measured. She wasn't supposed to hear. But she did. "I'll give her a week." Hargrove's voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "The mouse is already cracking. Did you see her jump when I dropped that chart yesterday? Perfect little flinch." Dr. Conrad, the orthopedic attending, laughed, the kind of laugh that costs nothing and buys loyalty. "She won't last 5 days. I've seen med students with more spine. $50 says she quits by Friday," Hargrove continued, sliding a $50 bill onto the table with the ceremony of a man performing for an audience. "Anyone brave enough to take that action?" 2 doctors shook on it. Dr. Bennett and Dr. Sterling, both of them men who understood the geometry of power. It flowed downward, always downward, and the safest position was standing beside the man holding the hose. Their handshakes made soft sounds against the laminate table, like deals being made in back rooms that had no windows. Natalie's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. The kind of clench that happens when you've already survived worse pressure than this and you're choosing not to make a scene. She took one measured breath through her nose, the way she'd been trained to do in situations where showing weakness meant something got broken. Then she continued down the hallway as if she'd heard nothing. But the break room fell silent anyway. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then someone coughed, and the betting resumed, slightly more quietly, the way men talk when they suspect they've been overheard but don't care enough to stop. That evening, Natalie sat alone in the employee break room with her turkey sandwich and a bottle of water. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. She ate mechanically, her eyes tracking the clock above the microwave, 2,147 hours, thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously. The kind of mental compartmentalization that keeps you functional when your insides are the texture of wet steel wool. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had faced worse than a surgeon with a gambling problem. She had held men who were hemorrhaging out on desert sand. She had tied field sutures while incoming rounds punched through corrugated metal walls. She had walked away from all of that precisely because she couldn't do it anymore, because the weight of it had calcified somewhere behind her ribs and wouldn't dissolve. A hospital break room betting pool was nothing. It was air. It was static. She finished her water and returned to the floor. The next day was lunch rush. The cafeteria was a compressed chaos of rotating trays and voices and the sound of plastic utensils on ceramic plates. Natalie moved through it like a person walking through a crowd at an airport, present but separate, aware of the physics of space around her body. Her tray held a salad and a cup of tomato soup and a roll. She was passing the doctor's table when it happened. Hargrove extended his leg slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough. The tray caught his shoe and went into the air like something airborne and doomed. The bowl tipped. Soup erupted across the tile in a red-orange arc, splashing across her scrubs, soaking through to her skin. The plate followed. Silverware cattered. A glass tumbled and didn't break, rolled under a chair. The entire cafeteria went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens when everyone is calculating whether they should look, should laugh, should pretend they didn't see. Hargrove picked up a patient file from his table. It had been sitting there, prepared, and tossed it at her feet. The pages scattered into the soup like paper boats sinking. He leaned back in his chair, his expression arranged into something that resembled casual amusement, though his eyes held the quality of a predator watching prey that had stopped running. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Or is bending over too difficult for someone with your limited skill set?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, people pretended to eat. Pretended not to be listening. Pretended this wasn't a public execution of someone's career. The silence had a texture now. It was heavy, oxygenated, the kind of thick air that comes before weather changes. Natalie took one measured breath. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She didn't wipe it. Didn't turn away. She simply bent, her movements precise and methodical, and began collecting the scattered pages. The soup soaked through her scrubs at the knees, cold and viscous against her skin. She gathered each page carefully, stacking them, her hands moving with the kind of deliberate focus usually reserved for surgical procedures. Around her, no one moved. No one spoke. The cafeteria had become a held breath. She stood. Wiped the tear with her thumb without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice came out quiet, level, the texture of someone who had already weighed the cost of words and decided the price was acceptable. "I've seen better men than you break under less pressure, doctor." Then she walked away. The pages were ruined. Her scrubs were ruined. The moment hung behind her like a door closing. She didn't look back. That was the part that landed hardest, not her words, but her complete refusal to acknowledge his response to them. He'd ceased to exist for her the moment her sentence ended. That absence of engagement, that refusal to let him occupy her attention, was a kind of violence he wasn't prepared for. The cafeteria resumed eating slowly. Conversations restarted. But the rhythm was different now. Someone had stood in front of power and hadn't flinched. That evening, Hargrove cornered her at the nurse's station. The scheduling board was directly behind him, white and rectangular and full of his authority. He approached from the side, the tactical approach, the angle that doesn't let you escape without being obvious about it. His smile carried the shape of teeth but nothing behind it. "You've been studying charts that don't concern you, mouse. Curious little thing, aren't you?" He tapped her temple with one finger. His nails were manicured. "Expensive. Curiosity and incompetence, dangerous combination. I'd hate to see you make a mistake that costs you everything." Natalie's jaw tightened. A single muscle fiber, barely visible. She turned back to her computer screen without responding, her fingers finding the keyboard, her attention settling on the patient portal in front of her like a physical thing she could hide behind. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't engage. Simply existed in her space and made it clear, through the architecture of her silence, that he'd already stopped mattering. Hargrove walked away whistling. But the whistle sounded different now, higher-pitched, slightly off-key, the sound of someone trying to convince themselves they'd won an argument that had already moved beyond words. The night shift settled in around them. At 0230 hours, the ER doors exploded open. The sound was immediate and catastrophic, the automated doors crashing against their stops, the screech of stretcher wheels, paramedics shouting in the compressed language of emergency medicine. The code announcement came over the intercom moments later, voice clipped and urgent, "Incoming trauma, massive internal bleeding, ETA 2 minutes." Natalie looked up from her charting station as the first responders wheeled through. The patient was unconscious, uniform soaked through with blood, the distinctive patch on his shoulder reading Air Force. An officer. Senior rank. The medevac team had the coherence of professionals who'd done this 1,000 times, estimated 40% blood loss, suspected liver laceration, BP 88/54 and dropping, GCS 4, no response to painful stimulus. The attending surgeon appeared, surveyed the situation for exactly 5 seconds, and stepped back. "Not touching it. Liability nightmare," he said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who'd learned that refusal was easier than competence. "Senior officer, critical injuries, congressional inquiry if he codes on our table. Transfer him. Colorado Medical can handle it." 2 more surgeons declined. Their reasons were variations on a theme: risk, career, politics, the particular calculus of self-preservation that moves through hospitals like an infection. Each refusal made the air pressure in the trauma bay change slightly, the way atmosphere shifts before a storm. Then Hargrove appeared. He moved past the colonel with barely a glance, his focus already on logistics, on the machinery of transfer, on the particular satisfaction of walking away from a problem instead of solving it. He made a call to the chief of surgery at home, his voice smooth and assured, "We're transferring to Colorado Medical." Stabilize only, no invasive procedures. I want him packaged and moving within 30 minutes. But the colonel's chest was struggling for air. Natalie watched from the nurse's station, her hand stilling over the keyboard. The patient's lips were beginning to mottle blue at the edges. The respiratory effort was becoming labored, the kind of stridor that comes when something is compressing the chest cavity from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. Minutes, not hours. She knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat. She approached Hargrove before he could turn away. Dr. Hargrove, he needs immediate needle decompression or he won't survive transport. His face changed. The muscles around his eyes hardened. Did I ask for your input, mouse? Stand down or I'll have security remove you. His voice had the particular quality of something cold and sharp, like surgical steel in winter. The colonel's lips turned darker. The young Air Force medic assisting looked frozen, suspended between the weight of authority and the weight of a dying man. His hand hovered near the chest tube setup, uncertain. Natalie looked at the dying officer. Then at Hargrove. Then back at the patient. She knew what this decision cost. She knew the geometry of insubordination, the particular angles of her own career, the fragile balance of staying hidden versus stepping forward. She knew all of it, weighed all of it, and then made the only choice a person could make when someone was about to die while she stood watching. I'm staying with him. Hargrove's smile was thin, surgical, exact. Then you're doing it alone. And when he dies, it's on your license. He walked away, taking every doctor with him. The trauma bay emptied like a wound draining, leaving Natalie standing alone with a dying man and a young medic whose hands were shaking. She called out, her voice steady and low, a command without inflection, I need the crash cart and someone brave enough to hold a chest tube. One surgical resident and the Air Force medic remained. The rest of the team had scattered like birds. But that was enough. Sometimes that was all you ever got. She began moving, her hands reaching for the needle kit, her mind already 3 steps ahead, already in the muscle memory of keeping people alive when everything else had abandoned them. What happened next didn't just change the trajectory of Natalie's shift. It brought someone who was supposed to stay hidden within reach of a truth that had been stalking her since the moment she'd walked through Mercy General's doors. The ER doors exploded open at 0230 hours. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher moving like they were pushing through water, urgent, controlled, practiced. The man on it was unconscious, his Air Force flight suit soaked dark with blood, uniform torn open where shrapnel had found him somewhere over Sanjin. The medevac team called out vitals in that clipped, efficient shorthand that made everyone in the trauma bay move faster. Massive internal bleeding. Tension pneumothorax. Blood pressure dropping. ETA on the colonel's arrival had been 3 minutes. Now he was here. Now everything changed. Dr. Hargrove stood at the entrance to Trauma Bay 1, watching the paramedics transfer the patient to the hospital bed. He didn't move. His hands stayed in his pockets. The surgical attending, Dr. Chen, looked at him, waiting for assignment. Hargrove shook his head. Not my case, he said. Too unstable. Optics are terrible if he doesn't make it. Chen nodded, already looking to reassign. The second attending, Dr. Morrison, was already backing away. Agreed. Unacceptable risk profile. Who's on call for trauma? The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. No one answered. Nurses stood frozen. The resident assigned to the case, a third-year named Patterson, looked pale as hospital walls. He started, then stopped. I don't have the experience. The colonel's oxygen saturation was dropping. 73%. 71. The machines were screaming numbers that meant he was drowning in his own blood while every doctor in the room found reasons to walk away. Natalie Hayes pushed through the growing crowd at the bay door. She didn't ask permission. She didn't raise her hand. She simply moved to the patient's side and started assessing, her eyes tracking the monitor, her hands already reaching for what she would need. I'm staying, she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I've got this patient. Hargrove's face shifted. Something cold moved behind his eyes. He stepped forward. Resident Hayes, you're a floor nurse. You don't have, I said I've got him, Natalie repeated. She was already cutting away the flight suit, already reading the wound pattern, the entry angles, the trajectory of the trauma. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before, not once, not twice, but dozens of times in conditions that would have made this sterile Denver trauma bay look like a sanctuary. She didn't wait for authorization. She turned to Patterson. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Now. He moved. The resident moved without hesitation because something in Natalie's voice had shifted. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The colonel's left chest wall was hyperinflating. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing his lung, pushing his heart aside, crushing his circulation. If she didn't decompress it in the next 40 seconds, he would code. Natalie located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the landmark burned into muscle memory so deep it didn't require thought anymore. She palpated the rib above the space. Found the spot. Her fingers were steady. Steady as surgical lasers. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in with a single smooth motion. There was a hiss, the sound of 3 weeks of compressed air and blood escaping, the sound of pressure dropping, the sound of a man getting a second chance at breathing. The heart monitor changed its rhythm. The oxygen saturation climbed. 73, 76. 81, the colonel's color improved. His chest rose and fell with actual lung expansion instead of that terrible asymmetrical heaving. Hargrove watched from the doorway. His jaw clenched. He turned and walked away, already reaching for his phone, already thinking about how to frame this, how to spin the insubordination he'd just witnessed into something he could use. But he was making a mistake. He always made mistakes when he assumed someone was ordinary. When he assumed a floor nurse was just a floor nurse. When he didn't know that the hands moving across that patient's chest had once held entire units together through firefights that lasted 11 hours. Hands that had pulled people back from the edge so many times she'd stopped counting. Alpha arrived with no improvement in the internal bleeding. Natalie had placed 2 large-bore 4s, started the rapid infuser, pushed for units of O negative through the lines. The colonel's abdomen was distended, hard as a board. Bleeding into the peritoneal cavity, nowhere for blood to go but deeper into shock. She needed a surgeon. She called for a surgical consult, her voice level, her words precise. The operator paged Dr. Hargrove. 10 minutes passed. 12. The colonel's pressure dropped to 65 systolic. Natalie called again. Hargrove's voice crackled over the speakerphone this time, loud enough for everyone in the bay to hear. Resident Hayes is not authorized for surgical decisions. All procedures cease immediately. That is an order. The surgical resident, Patterson, the same one who'd moved without hesitation before, looked at Natalie. Terror in his eyes. Uncertainty. He was 26 years old and about to be told by his attending that he couldn't help. Natalie made a choice in that moment. A choice that would cost her everything. She turned to Patterson and said 5 words. Then you didn't see me do this. She prepped the surgical field with meticulous care, hands moving through the motions of preparation, draping, sterile technique, the kind of field setup that required training not taught in nursing school. Not taught anywhere except in corpsmen schools run by the Navy where they taught you how to save lives when there were no hospitals, no surgeons, no safety nets. Just you and someone bleeding out and your hands and your knowledge and the understanding that if you didn't move exactly right, people died. Our 8 came with 2 code blues. The colonel's heart stopped. The monitor flatlined. Natalie ran the code with the precision of someone who had done it dozens of times. Chest compressions. Epinephrine. The electrical shocks that made his body arch up off the bed. She brought him back. 60 seconds of CPR. His rhythm returned, sinus, fast, fragile, but there. His eyes didn't open, but his heart kept beating. 37 minutes later, the second code. This time the flat line lasted longer. Natalie ran it longer. Her compressions never wavered. Her voice calling out drugs and doses and time intervals remained calm, clinical, absolute. 2 minutes of continuous rhythm work. The colonel came back again. The machines that monitored him showed a heart that was hanging on by the thinnest thread, but hanging nonetheless. Exhaustion was starting to show in the set of her shoulders. But her hands were still steady. Still moving. Still fighting. Hour 12 brought the chest tube insertion. An Air Force medic had been assisting since hour 3, a young man, maybe 28, with the kind of bearing that suggested regular active duty, probably assigned to stay with the patient and report back. He'd been watching Natalie work, watching her move through procedures that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training, from somewhere in the bone itself. Now he was helping her insert the chest tube, the procedure that would drain the fluid that was accumulating around the colonel's lung, that would give his heart room to beat properly. Natalie prepped the site, made the incision through skin and fascia and into the pleural space with an exactness that made the medic's eyes widen. She threaded the tube with her left hand while her right hand guided the catheter, movements flowing like they were choreographed, like her body was remembering something her mind had left behind. Then she needed to secure it. She pulled out suture material and began the closing pattern. 3 stitches. Not the standard technique. A pattern with a specific twist on the second and third knots, a technique that distributed pressure differently, that held better in field conditions where equipment was limited and improvisation was survival. The medic went completely still, watching her hands move. His breathing changed. Something in his body recognized something in hers. She completed the final knot and he whispered, barely audible, "Only one person ties it that way." The words fell into the space between them like a stone into still water. Natalie's hands paused for exactly half a second. She didn't look up. She said, "You're mistaken," and her voice cracked, barely, just enough for someone who knew what to listen for to hear the fracture beneath the composure. The medic stared at her for another long moment, then looked back at the colonel. "Senior Chief Phantom," he said. Not a question. A recognition. A name that hadn't been spoken to her in 3 years. A name that belonged to someone who didn't exist anymore. Natalie kept working. She didn't confirm. She didn't deny. She simply moved to the next task, but something in her had shifted. The mask was thinner now. The distance between who she was and who she was pretending to be had collapsed into a space she could no longer bridge. The resident fell asleep in the chair at hour 10, his head against the wall, exhaustion finally overcoming adrenaline. The medic stayed quiet after that, assisting without speaking, his eyes occasionally returning to Natalie's hands as she worked, as though he was still trying to convince himself he was wrong, that he'd misidentified the pattern, that the woman in front of him wasn't someone he thought had died in a phi base north of Sanjin. At hour 16, the colonel's vitals stabilized. Truly stabilized. Not the fragile, gasping stability of a man barely hanging on, but something approaching equilibrium. His heart rate was still elevated but holding. His oxygen saturation was solid. The internal bleeding had slowed enough that her field repair was holding. He was going to live. Against every physician in this hospital, against the infection risk and the complications that still waited in his future, this man from Sanjin was going to survive because Natalie Hayes had refused to let him die alone. She staggered to the locker room at 0630 hours. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat and blood. Her hands were trembling now, PTSD breaking through after 16 hours of adrenaline and focus, the shaking that came when you finally let your guard down, when your nervous system realized it could stop fighting. She gripped the locker door to steady herself, taking long, measured breaths, forcing herself back to center, pulling the composure back over her shoulders like armor. And then she saw it. The envelope taped to her locker, white and official and damning. She opened it with wet hands. The letter was signed by Dr. Hargrove and 2 board members she'd never spoken to, never met. Insubordination. Unauthorized procedures. Violating chain of command. Effective immediately. Terminated. The words blurred. The paper shook in her hands. But she didn't fall. She didn't cry. She sat down on the bench, still in her blood-soaked scrubs, and stared at nothing. And then her phone rang. It was the administrator's voice that pulled her back. Not Hargrove's, worse. The calm, measured tone of institutional power. "Miss Hayes, we need you in conference room B. Now." She knew before she walked in. 3 days of waiting, 3 days of checking on the colonel's vitals through cracked doorways, 3 days of watching Hargrove construct his narrative in the hallways while she stayed invisible. The room smelled like old coffee and furniture, Polish, the kind of smell that belonged to decisions already made. 2 board members sat across from her. Hargrove stood to the side, folder in hand, expression arranged into concerned professionalism. "We've reviewed your file," the first board member began, a woman with silver hair and a pen poised over a legal pad. "There are serious concerns regarding your conduct during the recent critical case. Insubordination. Unauthorized medical interventions. Proceeding with procedures without physician oversight." Natalie didn't move. Didn't flinch. The room was fluorescent bright and airless, the kind of space designed to make you feel trapped before you understood the cage. Hargrove opened the folder. "I personally supervised this case," he said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "The patient's recovery is a testament to my surgical team's dedication. However, Ms. Hayes took it upon herself to make decisions that put the hospital at liability." He turned a page. "There's also a pattern of questioning billing procedures. Accessing files outside her authorization. We've spoken with your references," the second board member added. "They describe concerning behavioral issues. Confrontational. Difficult to supervise." There were no references. Natalie had left that line blank on her application, had moved 17 times in 5 years, had no one to call, no one who could verify she'd existed anywhere long enough to matter. Hargrove had filled in the blanks himself, voices on phones that never happened, words from people who'd never seen her face. "Effective immediately, your employment at Mercy General is terminated." The silver-haired woman slid a packet of papers across the table. "Severance. Non-disclosure agreement. A release acknowledging Natalie accepted the terms of her dismissal. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You'll need to return your badge and access codes." Natalie stood. The movement felt mechanical, like watching someone else stand up from someone else's chair. She didn't reach for the papers. "You should know," Hargrove said, almost gently, "that I've documented everything. You're lucky we're not pursuing further action. Your conduct could have cost lives." She turned to look at him then. Just a glance, the kind of look that lasts a half-second but lands like a punch. His eyes flickered. For a moment, he saw something he didn't expect, not anger, not desperation, but the flat, empty certainty of someone who'd already calculated every possible outcome and found them all acceptable. Security was waiting in the hallway. Young man, early 20s, uncomfortable with the weight of authority he'd been given for just this purpose. He led her to the locker room without speaking. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Everything smelled like industrial cleaner and damp fabric. Her locker was small. She'd kept almost nothing at Mercy General. A change of clothes. Some hand cream. A photograph she'd carried since Sanjin, the unit gathered in front of Firebase Phoenix, 12 faces pressed close, the Taliban artillery audible in the distance. She'd circled 6 of them weeks ago, permanent marker, red circles that wouldn't wash off no matter how many times she tried. But there was something else in the locker now. A cardboard box, already filled. On top, a cracked ceramic mug, the break ran through the words "World's Okayest Nurse" in chipped blue lettering. A dying succulent, its leaves paper thin and grey. And the photograph, the one from Sanjin, placed face down so she'd have to flip it to see the names she couldn't look at without counting by the red circles. Someone had packed this for her. Someone kind, or someone cruel. Natalie couldn't decide which. She took the box. Didn't say goodbye. The security guard escorted her to the back exit, past the emergency bay where ambulances idled, where the sound of sirens was constant as breathing. The Denver afternoon was cold, already threatening rain. The bus stop was 6 blocks away. She walked it in 15 minutes, the cardboard box growing heavier with each intersection. By the time she reached the shelter, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then harder, the kind of rain that comes to mountain cities and doesn't apologize for it. She sat on the bench. The photograph was still in her hands. She didn't remember taking it out of the box, but here it was, the edges soft from being held. 12 people. 6 red circles. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed. Corporal James Hutchins. Lance Corporal David Torres. Petty Officer 2nd Class Kyle Brennan. Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Tyler Voss. And Chief Petty Officer Robert Chandler. She whispered their names to the rain because the rain wouldn't judge her for still remembering them perfectly, for knowing exactly how they died, for understanding that she was supposed to have followed them instead of disappeared. The rain hammered on the metal roof of the bus shelter, a rhythm like helicopter rotors, like the percussion of incoming fire, like everything she'd been running from for 5 years. A bus pulled up, Denver Transit, heading south. The doors opened. She could see the interior, dry and warm and full of people with normal lives and normal problems and no red circles. She didn't board. Instead, she pulled out her phone. The resignation letter was still there, the draft she'd started weeks ago, the one she couldn't send because admitting why would mean admitting what she'd done, what she'd survived, what she'd buried so deep that only her hands remembered how to work. She opened it. The words were simple: I hereby resign from my position effective immediately. She added one line at the bottom: Hayes, Natalie J., Naval Special Warfare, 3 combat deployments, Sanjin District. She didn't explain it. Didn't provide details or dates or justifications. She just hit send to HR, watched the email disappear into the institutional void, then deleted her email app from her phone. Whatever came next wasn't hers to control anymore. The bus left without her. She sat in the rain, the cardboard box at her feet, the cracked mug and dying plant and photograph of 6 dead soldiers, her only possessions in a city that didn't know her name. It was nearly dawn when she made the decision. Not a decision, really, muscle memory took over. She showered. Changed into dark jeans and the jacket she'd worn the night she arrived in Denver, the one with the faded SEAL unit patch sewn into the lining years ago, the patch she'd hidden so carefully that even she sometimes forgot it was there. She looked at herself in the mirror of her small apartment and barely recognized the woman looking back. The nurse was gone. What remained was older, harder, wearing composure like armor. Mercy General's ICU was quiet at 5:11 a.m. Shift change was at 6-7 minutes of controlled chaos while night staff handed off to day staff, the brief window when security wasn't watching the hallways, when badge readers could be bypassed by someone who'd spent years learning how to move through restricted spaces without being seen. She'd done this in forward operating bases, in hospitals in Kandahar, in places where being noticed meant being remembered and being remembered meant being hunted. The colonel's room was on the east wing. She reached it without seeing anyone. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, O2 sat at 94%, heart rate stable at 68, blood pressure improving by the hour. He was healing. The medical procedures she'd performed, the ones Hargrove had called and authorized, had worked. He was alive because she'd stayed when everyone else had walked away. She reached across him to check the ventilator settings. The tube was clear. His breathing was good. As she leaned over, her jacket opened, just slightly, and the patch was visible, the faded emblem of her unit, the symbol of 12 people, 6 of whom were gone. His eyes snapped open. The grip came like lightning, his hand shot out, fingers closing around her wrist with surprising strength for a man who'd been unconscious for 3 days. His eyes were blue and sharp and suddenly entirely present, the eyes of someone who'd trained his entire life to recognize danger, to identify the unknown. His voice was a rasp, barely functional, his throat raw from the endotracheal tube, but the word came clear: phantom. The room held its breath. The ventilator continued its rhythm. The monitors continued their beep. But something fundamental had shifted, the kind of shift that happens when a secret becomes known, when the invisible becomes visible. The nurse at the station outside glanced up. The night shift medic, the one who'd been hovering near the colonel's room all morning, stepped inside. 2 orderlies stopped in the hallway. The colonel did not release Natalie's wrist. His eyes remained locked on the patch. The door opened wider. A man in Air Force dress uniform entered, captain, insignia sharp, face carrying the colonel's features like an inheritance. The captain took in the scene immediately, his father gripping a nurse's arm, the intensity in the room, the weight of something unspoken. "Senior Chief Petty Officer," the captain said. Not a question. A recognition. The room went quiet. That particular silence that settles when powerful people realize they've made a catastrophic mistake. Dr. Hargrove stood near the colonel's bed, speaking to 3 hospital board members in the tone he'd perfected over 23 years, confident, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to controlling every conversation in his orbit. Regardless of her background, Nurse Hayes was terminated for gross insubordination and unauthorized surgical intervention. The decision stands. This incident doesn't change hospital policy regarding scope of practice. If anything, it reinforces why we need stronger oversight of our nursing staff. One of the board members shifted her weight. The administrator beside her checked his watch. Then the colonel's eyes opened wider. His voice, still rough from the ventilator, still carrying the rasp of a man who'd nearly died 48 hours ago, cut through Hargrove's monologue like a scalpel through tissue. "She saved my life when your entire staff refused to touch me." Each word came slow, deliberate, measured like rounds of ammunition. Every single one. Hargrove's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered at the corner of his left eye. A reckless act that violated hospital protocol and exposed us to catastrophic liability. The board has already. The captain stepped forward. Natalie recognized the movement, controlled, purposeful, the kind of step that men trained to move through hostile territory take. He pulled out his phone, the screen catching the overhead lights. "I've contacted JG and the Air Force Inspector General." A decorated service member denied treatment, then fired for providing it. "They're very interested in the circumstances here." The board members exchanged glances. One of them went pale, actually pale, the color draining from her face like water from a punctured vessel. "That's not," Hargrove started. "The paperwork is already filed," the captain continued. His voice carried no anger. That was what made it devastating. Anger was emotion. This was just fact. "They're sending an investigator. Probably tomorrow." One board member whispered to the other. They stepped into the hallway. Hargrove followed, his composure cracking like thin ice under weight. Through the glass walls of the ICU, Natalie watched him gesture emphatically at the departing board members. Watched his mouth move. Watched them not turn around. She heard fragments, overreaching authority. And standard termination protocol. And no precedent for reversing this decision. The board members stopped listening. They started making phone calls. Hargrove stood alone in the corridor, his expensive tie suddenly too tight, his position dissolving like sugar in water. An hour later, the hospital administrator appeared at Natalie's locker in the staff room. His expression was careful, the kind of careful that comes from having already consulted with legal counsel. "Nurse Hayes. If you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you privately." They sat in a conference room with a table that cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. The administrator slid a document across the polished surface without meeting her eyes. Dr. Hargrove acted hastily. "We'd like to correct this mistake. Your reinstatement, effective immediately. Back pay for the 3 days. Full clearance to return to your previous position." Natalie looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. "What about the billing discrepancies I flagged?" The administrator blinked. His hands moved to the table edge. "I'm not aware of any." "You will be." Natalie pulled out her phone. Opened her photo backup, 16 weeks of meticulous documentation, every suspicious charge photographed, dated, cross-referenced with patient charts. She turned the screen toward him. Dr. Hargrove has been running an insurance fraud scheme through phantom procedures. 14 confirmed cases before he started targeting me. All documented. The administrator's expression shifted from conciliatory to something closer to terror. His tie suddenly seemed too tight as well. These are serious allegations. They're facts. And he forged my personnel records to justify my termination. Federal crime. Obstruction of justice. Natalie's voice hadn't changed, still quiet, still even. But something had shifted in the way she held the phone, the way she met his eyes. You might want to call legal again. The administrator stood abruptly. He left the room. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't close the door. 2 hours later, the hospital's energy changed. That particular electrical shift that happens when federal agents walk through a building, like someone had opened all the windows at once and let in the weather. 3 FBI agents moved through the corridors with the kind of purposeful calm that comes from doing this exact thing hundreds of times. They didn't run. They didn't hurry. They just walked, carrying documents in folders, their badges visible on lanyards. They entered Dr. Hargrove's office. Natalie watched from 30 feet away. She could see him at his desk, could see his face transition through the stages like frames in a film reel. Confident to confused to comprehending to terrified. All in 30 seconds. He pointed toward the hallway, toward her, unmistakably, clearly blaming someone else for whatever this was. One of the agents shook her head. She placed a laptop on his desk, turned the screen toward him. Opened a file. Hargrove's face went white. Actually white, like all the blood had relocated to somewhere inside his body where it couldn't be seen. The lead agent stood. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, you're under arrest for insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Hargrove's hands went behind his back. The handcuffs made that particular sound, not quite a click, more a definitive metallic settling. The sound of something closing that wasn't going to open again soon. Staff gathered in the hallway as he was walked past them. Nurses from the night shift, residents, orderlies. 20 people watching in absolute silence, that profound quiet you get in hospitals when everyone is simultaneously holding their breath. The kind of silence that has weight. Hargrove's eyes found Natalie's as he was led toward the exit. For one moment, their gazes locked. She took one measured breath, allowed herself one tear, just one, precise as a surgical incision, and said nothing. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above them. He was gone. 2 years evaporated like water from a hot road. Time moved differently after that. Natalie had discovered that when the thing you've been running from finally stopped chasing, the running itself got harder. You had to find a new reason to move forward. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood beside a folding table outside a strip mall in Commerce City, 15 miles from Mercy General. The sun beat down on asphalt that shimmered like oil on water. His banner, faded and fraying at the edges, advertised supplemental insurance products. He held clipboards. He wore a polo shirt from Target. People walked past without making eye contact. They always did. His 2019 Lexus, repossessed 6 months ago, had been replaced by a 2007 Honda Civic with a check engine light that never went off. He no longer belonged to the country club. His license to practice medicine had been suspended pending appeals he couldn't afford. His wife had taken the house and most of his savings to make the charges go away quietly. He approached a woman carrying shopping bags. She waved him away before he could speak. Meanwhile, at Mercy General, the lighting in the conference room was different, softer, intentional. The hospital had renovated the space, added windows that looked out on Denver's skyline. Natalie stood at a podium, wearing professional civilian clothes that somehow made her bearing more unmistakably military, not less. The way she held her shoulders. The way her weight distributed evenly, ready to move. The way her eyes tracked the room. The colonel sat in the front row, his color returned, his breathing unlabored, his son beside him in uniform. Behind them, staff from every department, nurses, orderlies, physicians, even some of the board members. The Combat Veterans Medical Initiative was being unveiled. "We hide for different reasons," Natalie said. Her voice had changed over 2 years. Quieter, but somehow more present, like a tuned instrument producing exactly the frequency it was designed to produce. Some to heal. Some to escape. Some because the world doesn't have a place that feels safe anymore. This program ensures no veteran has to hide alone. The room stood. The applause was like rainfall. The colonel made his way to the stage. He carried a shadow box in his hands like it contained something sacred, which it did. Inside, perfectly preserved, Natalie's dress whites from a Navy ceremony she'd never attended. And her Navy Commendation Medal, finally taken from its storage box. He pinned it to the display frame behind her. The photo beside it showed them both, her in dress uniform, his expression one of a man who'd just woken up and found himself still alive. The caption read, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Command, Sanjin District, 2014 to 2017. A reporter raised her hand. "What would you say to those who doubted you, Nurse Hayes?" Natalie considered. One moment of silence. "Then, I'd say nothing. I learned a long time ago that the loudest voices are rarely the strongest." Her hand moved to her jacket, that worn fabric, the faded patch still sewn inside, still close to her heart. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The colonel nodded once. A gesture of acknowledgement. Of respect. Of two people who'd looked into the same kind of darkness and refused to look away. The room stood again. Natalie allowed herself one quiet breath, and for the first time in years, she didn't count the faces she'd lost in Sanjin. She counted the ones she'd saved. And in the space where the hiding used to be, there was something else now, not peace, exactly, but something close. Something like home. If you know someone who's been underestimated because of what's on the surface, because of what they choose to hide, share this with them. Subscribe for more stories about the ones we overlook until we can't anymore. And comment, what would you have done in Natalie's position, stayed and fought, or left to find peace?